Oh boy. Blabbermouth here is 4 minutes late. I'll have, Dave will probably deduct my compensation.
Let me see what I.
So grab your last cup of coffee and a chair, and we can begin with the morning program.
I'm good enough.
So, as I said, good morning on this beautiful spring day. And for those of you who did not attend the concert yesterday or listen to a replay of it, replay is available on the church website. If you're interested in great music, do so. The choir did a fantastic job, just fantastic on a piece of music that is very difficult to perform. If I do say so, I did all the practices, but I could not do the concert. We had a conflict with our grand twins up in Massachusetts was on Sunday, so we opted to go up there. So I missed it. I watched the replay last night when we got home, and just blew me away. They did such a great job on it, and it was very good. Full house, and which was nice to see in this day. So that was great also. But thank you all for being here, and I'll open with a prayer, and then we'll move on with the morning's program. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this glorious day. Thank you for this gathering of people for fellowship. Good to see so many people out. We ask, Lord, that you be with us as we go through this day and the week. Be with us all and be with those that can't be here for whatever reason, be it health issues or other things that are in the way. Just be with them. Thank you for the performance of the Brahms Requiem yesterday and the folks that were able to hear it in person. Just thank you for having a good weather for that event. Ask that you be with us and be with our country as we go through healings and reconciliations. Just bless this day. Amen. And Dave, if you would step up and do the honor of welcoming John. I have one thing I'll pass. Sorry. Yeah, I just forget things as I keep aging. Now I have to put my glasses on. So if you're looking closely and rather at your schedule of Tuesday morning fellowship speakers, rather than just showing up, there's a change in the schedule so you don't get disappointed or wonder if you've missed the wrong date. Next week's speaker will be Dave on General Custer. That's a change between Herb Brownette and Dave, flipping April 4th and the 18th around because of some scheduling conflicts. But just so you know, there'll be a little differences when you show up. You say, wait a minute, this presentation's not about what's Herb talking about? I forgot. Anyway, Dave's will be on General Custer. So Dave, with that, and also I think for John, there's a picture signed by an astronaut. You saw that this morning?
I heard about it.
So there you go, Dave.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll shut them off.
I guess if you came here today hoping to hear which Hollywood film studio faked the lunar landing, we're not going to hear about that. John Conrad is here in person. He's been on Zoom for us twice, but he's here in person today. He followed his childhood interest in space and space flight through aeronautical engineering degrees at U.S. Air Force Academy at Purdue University, straight into leadership in unmanned space programs for the Air Force and NASA. He's now retired, and his extensive career experience never wandered far from technology development and application in aerospace and defense, as well as IT and energy and security programs. But today he's going to talk on lunar reflections, how and why we went to the moon, and perhaps how we're going to go back there in the next decade. So without further ado, John Conrad.
Thanks. Do you want me to use this
Yes, I think so.
I'd kind of like to not black the screen here, so
Uh,
let me
you'll-
make sure. Can
you'll be
everybody
fine.
see it from here? I'm gonna,
I'll put this over
yeah,
here.
let me just slide this to the right a little, to
Yep.
make sure that I'm not in anybody's way.
Oh, you'll be fine.
Because the slides really do matter.
Yes.
How's that?
You okay? Okay.
Good. Hello to you all.
Good morning.
I'm bigger than you thought. I have legs. It's really nice to be here in person and without masks and everything. Anyway, it's a delight. I'm glad to come back and talk to you folks. And this is one of my favorite subjects. And this actually is a talk that I've only given once before. It was invited by the Department of Astronomy and Earth Science, I think they're called at Westchester, for the 50th anniversary of Apollo. And so I gave it up there once before to the public. And I do, of course, update these. And one of the things I update is the view on the title slide of the moon. And so I actually came up with this title because of what you're seeing there, because not a lot of people think about it. And it's a simple thing, but how do we see? Well, we see these wonderful sights in the night sky sometimes, and the moon. And tonight, because it's a special night, there's an alignment of 5 planets, Mercury, Venus, and Jupiter are close to the horizon in the west, in case you get out and have a chance to look if it's clear. But also Uranus is there, which is very hard to see, but easy if you have binoculars. And then up higher is Mars. And so it's a rare night, and you can see these 5 things because of reflected light. None of them give off light. It's just a reflection. You're seeing me because of reflected light. If we were in a cave, there's no light source, and you literally can't see your hand because there's nothing to reflect. No photons are in there. If you look at a beautiful night sky, almost everything you see is not reflected light, just the bright ones like the moon. All the stars, like our sun, give off their own light. So it's just kind of an interesting fact that for the moon, you're always looking at reflected light. And so in this case, I looked up and found that we're in the 7th day of the lunar cycle. That's what the phase is. Through the month, if this works. Okay, give me just a second. See if I can kickstart it here. All right. Why are we frozen? Let's see. There we go. Okay. Through the month, and the month is called a month because of the word moon. It's a month. 30 days is a lunar cycle. So every month we go through this cycle from a new moon, where we're literally looking at the moon between us and the sun. So we're looking at the shadowed side of it. And then slowly, as the moon goes around us over a period of a month, the lighting on it changes. And when it's around on the other side, where the sun's here and the moon's directly opposite us, we see the full face, that's the full moon. And 2 weeks later, we're back around. So every month, you can remember now that that's the moon's favorite, the moon's phases. And so we're going to reflect today, not on the man on the moon, which maybe as a kid, your parents said you could see if you looked at the full moon, but real man on the moon. And we're going to talk about Apollo, but before we get there, we're going to talk a little bit about what came before Apollo, not just about what came before Apollo, which was in the 60s, but 10 years earlier, roughly in 57, was the Sputnik. And we're going to talk about before then. And we're literally going to start back when modern rocketry started, which was the 20th century. There were many rockets, especially in China, for frankly millennia before then, when somebody discovered gunpowder and figured out how to do fireworks. That happened for a long time. And as we know from the national anthem with the rocket's red glare, the Brits used some rockets against us at Fort McHenry. But real rockets, modern rockets, didn't get started till the last century. And so we'll take a quick look at who's responsible for rocketry. There are quite a number of gentlemen, no ladies, I'm afraid, but there were three men that are well known as being there at the beginning of modern rocketry. And one of them you probably can think of, but we're going to start with the first one, and he was Russian. And this picture makes me think of a peasant in Russia under the Tsars. And I don't know that he was a peasant, but he certainly was at that time, 1879 birth, under the Tsars. And he didn't have much schooling because he got scarlet fever when he was young. And Tsiolkovsky did most of his studying for himself. Most of what he learned from books and studying by himself, a long way from real institutions. And yet he became a university teacher. And he wrote on a number of subjects, one of which was rocketry, and for the first time sparked an interest in people. He wrote this particular book in 1903, and he was inspired by Jules Verne in a number of the ideas that he had in there. And he talked about not, quote, rockets, but reactive devices. And there are a number of people in here that probably remember Newton's laws. And the third one was action and reaction. Remember that? And so that's the way a rocket works. Basically, the hot gas is pushed in one direction, and the reaction to that force pushes the rocket in the other direction. It's not because the gas is pushing on the launch mount or the earth or anything else. You go up in space and you light the rocket off and it moves. It's not pushing against stuff, it's reacting to the force of the rocket coming out of the rocket nozzle. So he wrote about reactive devices. He had a number of ideas that were way ahead of their time. Liquid rockets was what he wrote about mostly. And he came up with the idea for how to have a multi-stage rocket, space elevator, which you may have heard of, and hovercraft, like are seen in some, in swamps and things like that, that hold the vehicle off the surface. Those were all ideas that he gave birth to, at least writing about them. The Tsiolkovsky rocket equation, I have to say, was brilliant because he actually was able to understand what a rocket engine was going to do before anybody had actually developed one like this with propellants, and mathematically express the basically the change in the volume of hot gases being reflected in the change in the velocity of a vehicle, of a mass. And that's his equation. It was correct. And he got the name, the father of astronautics, from that. Next comes the one that you're probably familiar with, Robert Goddard. And we all probably saw him in our textbooks, and we may have seen this picture. I think it's the most famous picture of him. And there he is just before the first test of a working liquid fueled rocket. And so what happened when he lit off this rocket, and the rocket is nothing more than that piece at the top with a nozzle filled with gasoline on a structure to hold it and point it straight up. And so he lit it off. It burned for 2.5 seconds. Gasoline was the fuel and air was the oxidizer. And it got about 184 feet away and about as high as a house, and landed in his Aunt Effie's cabbage patch, where he'd gone to her farm outside Boston to have this little experiment. But it became, if you will, kind of the liquid propellant shot heard around the world. From then on, everybody knew about it. He added gyros to stabilize this thing, and I'm sure he had different structures and put payloads on them, and figured out a way not to have everything crash by having a parachute bring it down softly. So he got the name the father of modern rocketry. And now came the nationality and the people that did the most to actually have practical rockets, and that was the Germans. And in my dictionary, at least, if you look up Teutonic and Sirius, this is the face that you see. This to me is the quintessential German professor. And Hermann Oberth became very famous. He was also pursuing the launching of liquid propellant rockets. And he wrote a book before he had any experiments. And the book was not just technical and came up with actually the ideas that led to the V2 rocket in World War II. But the book was written in a popular style. And so clubs started up in the 20s all around the world, not just in Germany, where young people probably like to talk about what we could do and get into space. And he'd written about this. And you can buy this book. There's a real picture of the real cover out on Amazon right now for $147. I checked the other day. So the English translation of Hermann Obert's book is out there. And as I said, there was lots of good engineering in the book, and there was the concept of the V2. And then he got underway as a professor training people. And so now here is what took place with his ideas. He finally did test out a liquid propelled rocket a few years after Goddard did. And one of his students, an 18-year-old named Werner von Braun, helped him out with this test. And so we all know about von Braun. We tend to think of him as an American. He was very much a German and named by Hitler if he accepted being part of the party, which he did, as a brilliant young engineer in the 30s, he led the German development of rockets at Peenemünde, which you've probably heard of on the, I guess it's the Baltic Sea at the north of Germany. And on his team was the man that inspired him, his professor, Hermann Obert. And so that's the background for the development of practically working rockets, because von Braun was an incredibly good and strong leader, solved problems with all of his engineers and scientists along the way, and they were very successful in developing the first very successful liquid launched rocket, the V2. In 1943, they finally tested it out and found it to be useful as a weapon, which they used for the last year and a half or so of the war, to unfortunately great effect across Western Europe and London. A lot of people were killed by the V2s. I'm thankful that von Braun and his team didn't succeed earlier. I'm not sure about the outcome of World War II if they had. At any rate, by the end of the war now, you can imagine that since the Germans were the only one launching rocket weapons, that the team there, a large team with a very effective manufacturing capability, realized how valuable they as individuals were going to be after the war, when it became clear that the Germans weren't going to win the war. And the spy system was set up then, as it has been for millennia. And the Americans and the Soviets and everybody were trying to figure out how to get some of these German rocket scientists. And there is an amazing story to this, which you could read. I think there are books about it. I only know a little of it. But the fact is that von Braun was in contact with American spies who made arrangements for him, not just himself, but for dozens of his compatriots, engineers and scientists on the program, to leave toward the end of the war, and not just the people, but with much of their manufacturing equipment and pieces of rockets. And so after the war ended, the escape, if you will, had been arranged, and von Braun, because he had the SS credentials, was able to get through all the checkpoints as a trusted Nazi, which he claims afterwards he never was. He just did it so he could do his technical stuff, and I think that's probably true. At any rate, we ended up in the deserts in southern New Mexico, White Sands, with hundreds of German rocket scientists led by him, and train car loads full of equipment that came from Peenemünde, and it became our rocket program. It turns out that the Russians had also tried to do this. They got quite a number of the German scientists as well, And the Brits got some, the French got some. They were very much being sought after and managed to escape to different countries. So the V2 turned out to be as important a vehicle as there has been, sort of like the Model T. The V2, shown here in a record-breaking launch 4 years after the war, had a second stage on it. That thing you see on the top is called a WAC Corporal. And the folks that handle the ambassador program for NASA, JPL, developed that particular second stage rocket. And the combination of the V2 with that upper stage set the world record for altitude, 250 miles, which I remember going to the library as about a 6 or 7 year old and reading about in the science books, which incidentally were written by people like Willy Ley, if any of the rest of you have heard of him. He was another one of the scientists from Peenemünde. The Germans had an amazing impact on the rocket programs. The V2, to get back to that story then, became the basis for the first successful ballistic missile that the Army had at Redstone Arsenal in Alabama, the Redstone, which then got modified into being a launch vehicle, the Jupiter C, and finally ended up being supersized into the Saturn series of launch vehicles. It was all based on exactly the same technologies, just getting larger and larger for the next 15, 20 years, 25, I guess. The Russians as well had German scientists. They weren't as creative with the names of their rockets, but they developed these rockets with the help of the Germans over a period of years. And I highlighted the R7 there because the partner to the communists in the Soviet Union was China, and they traded the prints of, again, these German heritage type rockets to the Chinese. And so three nations, US, USSR, and China, the three major rocket powers through the last half of the 20th century, all were based on the V2. That was their heritage. And so wartime rocketry led to now what was in the Cold War missile development. And the Army was pushing hard on it, as I mentioned, at Redstone Arsenal with von Braun. The Air Force was born in 1947, the National Security Act, and they, because they were the ones that were supposed to pay attention to everything off the surface of the Earth, were expected to be involved in rockets. And so they were developing the Atlas and the Thor ballistic missiles. And so let's see what happened with all that. That was in the 50s now. So the space age finally began in the 50s. And it began with kind of an interesting story. In 1950, the gentleman you may have heard of, James Van Allen, and there was an interesting connection I heard about here with you folks. Van Allen, who was a University of Iowa, I think it was atmospheric physics professor, and a number of his international colleagues and also colleagues at American universities got together in 1950 and came up with an idea in his living room to push their governments to fund some earth sciences experiments. And they wanted to do this in a significant way, so they gave it a name. The governments agreed to it. I read about it in my weekly reader in grade school, and maybe some of you did as well. The International Geophysical Year became a target for a bunch of basically earth science experiments in 57 and 58. And so I remember seeing articles about it from time to time for a number of years. And along the way, projects would get invented and funded. And in 55, the US announced that one of their projects was to have small Earth circling satellites. Remember, we hadn't been in space yet. Now 250 miles up for the V2 WAC Corporal was way up into space, but you have to create the proper trajectory to stay in orbit. And nobody had done that. So here, you know, for those of us that were paying attention, you know, at the age of 10 or so, I was looking forward to seeing what was going to come next. And 4 days after the American announcement, the secretive Soviet society decided they'd announce the same thing. We were, as I think a lot of you folks remember, very much in a race which was really like a Cold War in the 50s against the Soviets for whether the free world was going to come out ahead or their world was going to come out ahead. And so we threw down the gauntlet, they picked it up. And to my great surprise, the headline in 1957 in October was of the Sputnik. And I was shocked. I was in what we call middle school now. And I never thought, that they'd beat us at something like this. And apparently the educators and a lot of the leaders also didn't think that, because for quite a while, there weren't just headlines about how did the Russians get ahead of us, but what we were gonna do about it. And so what I view now as the first wave of STEM took place in the late 50s. I don't know if any of you remember this, but all the schools where I was in the suburb of Cleveland accelerated their math programs and accelerated other programs. It was felt at the time that our educational system wasn't doing enough. It wasn't just the STEM stuff, it was also English, I remember. They came up with different names and pushed everything in the school system, which I at least think is a very good thing. At any rate, that happened. And it happened partly because there was this shock around the world where the free nations thought that America who was their leader, was ahead in every way. And clearly the Russians seemed to be ahead here. This little thing that they launched didn't do anything except beep, but it beeped all the time and everybody could listen to it and it was there and we hadn't done it. And so finally, we pushed our rocket people enough, and I mentioned the Army and the Air Force. They weren't allowed to try to do an Earth satellite launch because they were busy coming up with ballistic missiles as weapons. And so in their infinite wisdom, the government named the Navy, who weren't doing anything with rockets, to come up with a rocket. There we go. At any rate, so NRL, Naval Research Lab, were given the responsibility and they came up with a design and we're developing the Vanguard rocket. And some of you may remember, I remember watching on TV as the Vanguard finally 2 months later was much touted and was going to be our entry into the space race, and it blew up on the launch pad. And the media dubbed it Kaputnik, among other things. So, I mean, these are true stories. So there we had, a red face, and immediately the government, maybe Ike himself, said, look, the Army, von Braun had been just screaming to be given the responsibility because he knew that they could do it with their rockets. And so they took the Redstone, turned it into something called the Jupiter C rocket, plotted out the trajectory, and successfully launched the first US satellite, Explorer 1, a couple months after that. So 4 months after the Soviets, and incidentally after the second Sputnik as well. So we had the third satellite to get up there. And you can see a picture there of the Explorer 1 being held up by 3 men, and you get kind of an idea of the fact that it wasn't all that big, that 3 people could hold it. It's both the upper stage rocket built by James Pickering and his people out at JPL on the left there. The right-hand person is von Braun, and the one in the middle is none other than James Van Allen. So Van Allen, because he'd given birth, if you will, to the idea in 1950 and had predicted some radiation belts above the Earth, had his experiment on board our first launch. So where the Soviets just beeped, ours actually did meaningful science, and Van Allen belts were discovered with our first launch. So that's the history of the beginning of the space age. And so essentially, international cooperation on technical projects started by Van Allen ended up getting us into the space race in a very real way. And so now the question became who would get where next. So finally, the US decided they needed a space agency. The Army had launched our first satellite. They created something called the National, I guess it was the National Aerospace and some kind of National Space Act. and Eisenhower signed off on it, named T. Keith Glennon as the first administrator of this new agency reporting directly to the president, NASA, in July of '58. And in addition to doing satellites immediately, they decided that they wanted to inject man into the equation as soon as possible, because we knew the Russians were doing this. And so the Mercury program was named and announced in October, a few months after NASA was born. And in the announcement came a new term at the time, astronauts, for these spacemen that were going to fly. An interesting sidelight here about the early years, won't surprise any of us, which is that Ike, probably like most of the leaders, knew that these were all going to be men, even though the women were very much pushing at that time. There wasn't any debate about it. It wasn't even in the press. And he also knew that they were going to be military. And he knew the military people that understood how to do things in the air were the test pilots. And they already were risking their lives, pushing the envelope. So all of the early astronauts were military test pilot men. Not too surprisingly. In addition to about 6 months later, announcing that the Mercury program would have 7 astronauts, the award was made to Life, sort of like the award is made to one or another of the major networks now every 4 years about who gets the rights to broadcast the Olympics. This was which media would get the rights to publicly cover the astronauts, because they wanted to make sure that this got handled in the typical American way, which was very open and in a way that was very professional. So the different media networks and magazines bid on it, and Life won the contract to cover the astronauts exclusively. And they got around to doing their job fairly quickly. Here were 2 successive covers in September of '59, with the Mercury 7 on the left and their wives the next week on the right, to get all those stories out there to the public who was very hungry to learn about these spacemen. Now, one interesting feature was that that Life was, I would like to say, smart enough, but they realized that they had to do something to help these military people who on a day-to-day basis didn't look anything like this. They had uniforms on, or else they had their flight suits on. They didn't have civilian clothes. And so they needed to buy some civilian clothes, and the government wasn't going to buy them for them. And they needed to go lots and lots of speaking engagements, and the government didn't cover the travel for that. So each of them split up $500,000, so $70-some thousand per family, which was a fair amount of money back then, was used directly by the astronauts to budget for their clothing and their wives being covered and them traveling and speaking and things like that. It was a strange kind of feature. So they finally, about a year and a half later, got around to telling the public who was going to fly first. And we remember them well from left to right: Glenn, Grissom, and Shepard. And in the opposite direction is the order in which they flew. So you think about this, there's Alan Shepard, a Navy test pilot. JFK was Navy, he was president. So the first person to fly for the US was a Navy person. He didn't go into orbit, neither did Gus Grissom, the Air Force test pilot there in the middle. And the first guy to go into orbit was John Glenn, a Marine test pilot on the left. So that was the order, and we finally got our own man in space at that point. Incidentally, I didn't mention it, but these 3 men were 3 of the first 5 humans to go into space, because the Soviets had first Gagarin and then I think Titov fly before John Glenn and fly into orbit directly. They didn't have suborbital flights like we did. So once again, the Russians had a little edge on us at this point. In 1962, which is when Glenn finally orbited. And so now we'll look at the next program that was planned out ahead of time, which was to work out how we were going to be able to operate spacecraft in a way that Apollo would need them for the moon program. And they had this middle step, if you will, called Gemini. It took the Mercury capsule, made it a bit bigger so that it could hold 2 people. The name Gemini twins implies that. And so they added immediately a bunch of other astronauts. The front row is the 7, the Mercury 7. The back row 9 includes Neil Armstrong, among others. And so starting with these 16 and then a number of others that were named, they flew a number of missions to take this capsule, rendezvous, dock, and undock with another vehicle in space to demonstrate the things that the Apollo program needed. And here's a factor that just kind of still blows me away. After, remember, in 57, there'd not been anybody in space yet. Here we were 8 years later, and we had our second generation manned program, which launched 16 different people in 2-man crews on 10 different missions in a 20-month period. Now, to imagine doing things at that speed today, I don't know what's happened to us, but we aren't even close to that anymore. So it was very accelerated. A huge national budget had been given to NASA to do this, never to be matched again, incidentally. But Kennedy and others viewed winning this part of the space race as so important that they really did move a lot of other things around and make this a priority for the 60s. So now, how did those 10 missions, one every other month, do? Well, they proved out the ability of the Gemini capsule here, the right object you see, to rendezvous with, fly next to, another orbiting object. In this case, it was the Agena upper stage vehicle, and then actually dock with it and undock with it safely so that they could move up to it, dock so that people could move back and forth between the 2 vehicles, and then undock safely, which was exactly what the Apollo program was going to need, with the command module on the left there, docking with the lunar module, so that the people could get into the lunar module to go down to the surface at the appropriate time, and then come back up and dock and come home. So they did work out these things very successfully. They also, for the first time, did an EVA, a spacewalk, extravehicular activity. This is Ed White, an Air Force officer whose younger brother sat at a training table next to me at the Air Force Academy at the time. And so Ed White did this very successfully, I think in 65. And so the Gemini program was hugely successful. So finally, we're going to get to the moon program, which had been started a little earlier than Gemini took place. And I thought it was important to remember sort of the public kick in the pants that we all got when Kennedy said this, and this is now, what's that work out to, 4 months after his inaugural. He made the public statement that we were going to do this before the end of the decade, 8.5 years later, when we didn't even have any American that had orbited the Earth then. Glenn orbited the Earth about 9 months after this. So it was quite a push and quite a challenge to complete this. I guess I'll take just a minute and tell you a couple of things I've learned about the national leadership for the space program. Eisenhower hadn't been interested in it until the Russians put up Sputnik. We had the capability with the Atlas and with the Redstone, as you saw. Von Braun knew it. He'd been told many times. He didn't want to fund something going around up there that who cared about that. Okay, so Ike wasn't exactly a supporter of it, but immediately that it became a major part of the Cold War, he was right in there pushing it with the formation of NASA. Kennedy, in the campaign that a lot of us remember, where he and Nixon battled it out, and Kennedy had been publicly against the space program and said he was going to shut it down. Okay, Lyndon Johnson was quite a different individual. And so his vice presidential candidate kept the flame alive, if you will, after Kennedy was elected. And after Kennedy was inaugurated came Gagarin's first flight. And so now Kennedy had to look at the Soviets having a man in orbit, and we didn't. So Kennedy became a believer in this few-month period after his inauguration, with the help of Lyndon Johnson, who'd been pushing the space program at that time for years. And so it's not surprising that in Texas at Johnson is a big space center. And also that Kennedy got his name put on the launch center. All right, so back to the technical stuff. This is 54 individuals. The upper left one there is a photo I showed you before of the first Gemini astronauts. The selections 2, 3, and 4 there, or 3, 4, and 5 for the Apollo program came in the period from, I think, 63 to 66. The last ones mentioned or named included the group in the lower right there, where in the middle is Harrison Schmitt. And we probably remember Jack Schmitt, became a senator then. But he was the non-military, non-test pilot, civilian geologist. And they were smart enough to realize that in one of these landings, this was long before, you know, it actually happened. In one of these landings, since we're picking up moon rocks and stuff, maybe it would be good to have a geologist on the surface. And so he flew in the last Apollo mission and helped out a lot in that way. The rocket, we remember as the Saturn V until November, just a few months ago, it was the most powerful rocket ever launched on Earth. And it was essentially a 36-story building filled with millions of pounds of propellants that had to be lifted off against gravity and accelerated, which it did successfully because it had 5 of these giant F1 engines that were 1.5 million pounds of thrust each. If you've ever been to the Cape, and I think some other places have these, there will be an F1 nozzle usually on its side so that you can see that you can walk inside of it. These were just giant rocket engines. Again, just a supersize of what the V2 rocket had been in the 40s. And the same technology led by the same team, von Braun. So now we're going to look at the Apollo missions. We won't dwell on Apollo 11. I'll skip past that in a minute because we know so much about it. But I just want to note that from the beginning, we were pushing, and Mercury was a fast program, and Gemini was even faster, and Apollo started with the same kind of a pace. But the very first crew that was named, and without any question, Grissom would have been one of the first to walk on the moon. Grissom and Ed White, that spacewalker that I showed, and a new Navy guy, Roger Chaffee, were named to the first mission. And each mission would have 2 people on the surface and 1 flying around the moon for them to rendezvous with to come back. Well, these 3 were planned to be one of the early entrants, not that they were going to go directly to the moon in Apollo 1, but this kind of gave them first place as the missions carried through. And so here's another picture of the 3 of them praying. And they're praying over their Apollo capsule, Apollo 1, because they'd visited the manufacturer, they'd heard the NASA decision makers, and they'd become extremely worried about all the flammable material, literally, specifically, in their spacecraft. And so in January of '67, there was a dress rehearsal, if you will, on the launch pad, where they were fully fitted out, put into their capsule. The capsule was pressurized with pure oxygen. A spark took place, and the 3 of them died in the fire over exactly what they had sent messages and this picture to their higher ups to please address. Well, I mean, it's a pretty sad story, actually. At any rate, the program slowed down at this point. And finger pointing and investigations. NASA investigated themselves, which is always a fun activity, and put out their report. What is that? Not very long after the disaster. and I'm sure that they were very effective in describing what happened and what they do about it. Congress was much more suspicious and wanted to be more objective, so they had a much longer time that they took to investigate until finally they were fully satisfied that NASA discovered the problem. And one of the things that they changed, of course, was the pure oxygen atmosphere. And I'm sure another one had to do with the fact that you couldn't open the hatch from the inside. At any rate, they did their fixes to the Apollo systems, and they were given the authority to go forward. And remember, when the fire happened, this was a little less than 3 years before the end of the Kennedy window, when we were going to go to the moon and come back. And so more than halfway through that window, it took before Congress agreed with NASA to let them continue to go forward, 20 months into it. So now there's 15 months left. We haven't yet had the Apollo capsule into space at all. And that was what got things started with Apollo 7. And then Apollo 8 happened shortly after that. And Apollo 8 happened earlier by a month or so than it was supposed to, because our spies, the Russians, weren't very open about what they were doing, but they were trying to get a man to the moon before we did. Our spies told us that by the end of '68, they were going to be in orbit around the moon. And so we moved up Apollo 8. And what happened then was kind of a public relations success for us. Not only did the Russians not go in '68 or in December as we thought they were going to, but we got there by Christmas. For the first time, man was further away than they'd ever been, went into orbit around the moon. Frank Borman, one of the three, well, first of all, they created some memorable views looking across the lunar surface back at Earth like this. But they also had a very famous PR coup, if you will, in that Borman on Christmas Eve broadcast around the world, read from Genesis 1, the Christmas Eve broadcast, which kind of made humanity feel like they were pulled together. At least that's what I like to believe. At any rate, it was a very successful flight. They proved out that the rocket could get there. We hadn't yet finished designing or I should say developing and testing out all the parts of the Apollo. So they came back, and the second mission after that was the next one that went to the moon. And this was the final dress rehearsal. All the parts had to work. They had to be able to separate the lunar module out in lunar orbit, have it turn around, dock with it, have two people go into the lunar module. And so here is an artist concept of that. And so the command module, as all crews got to name their modules, was Charlie Brown. And the lunar module was Snoopy, of course. And so they got into Snoopy. They fired these rockets. They went down toward the moon. One astronaut stays behind in lunar orbit in the command module. And they went down 9 miles above the surface. And then they came back up. They docked. 2 men came back into the command module. They separated and they came back home. So the 2 of the 3 here would have been just itching by the time they got down there to land. And so NASA, and I don't think this is apocryphal, I think it's true, told the crew before they left that they'd only put enough propellant on board to do this, and that if they landed, there wouldn't be enough propellant to get back off the surface, because test pilots like to push the envelope, and they didn't want somebody saying, well, you know, we'd rather beg forgiveness than not make a mistake, and we accidentally landed. You know? That's a great story at any rate. I think it's true. So that was the dress rehearsal, and only 2 months later came the real thing, Apollo 11, which we all remember. Very successful, Armstrong and Aldrin on the surface and Collins orbiting. And then again, these things happened so fast back then. The next mission had Pete Conrad, that somebody had mentioned to me here. And Pete Conrad and his compatriot went down to the surface for the second landing of 2 men. And not long after that came the third and the second most famous Apollo mission, which had Bill Paxton and and Kevin Bacon and Tom Hanks here. Except that, of course, that's the movie about Apollo 13. And the real mission had these three guys who, frankly, were really heroes. You probably remember it was a tense week when the explosion that blew out a side of the service module you see there pointed at meant that they couldn't have a normal mission. And it wasn't even clear how they were going to get back to Earth. They were on the way to the moon at the time. And they used the lunar module and its engine in order to get them back, which hadn't been designed for at all, but it worked. So everything worked. And there were great cheers and a lot of relief when they landed. And so we didn't lose anybody in that one. Apollo 14 then was the next successful one. And then we had the last three. And these three are different than the first three in that while the first 6 men just walked around, these three each had the lunar rover. And so they got to spend more time outside the lunar module by quite a bit, and they got to drive around. And they drove quite a distance at times. And so very successfully got a lot of scientific data, placed a lot of experiments on the surface, things like seismometers and things like that. And they collected, by the time the 6 missions were done successfully and the 12 people had been on the moon, there was approaching 1/2 ton of lunar material back on Earth, which we're still analyzing today. And so the final mission there that had Harrison Schmitt, our geologist, and Gene Cernan on the surface, they left the surface just over 50 years ago, a few months ago, December 72. And we thought, at least I thought, and I was in the middle of the space program out in Vandenberg at the time, I just wondered what would come next and who'd land there next and that sort of thing. But as I said, it had been extremely expensive, a very high priority. There were lots of other priorities, like the space shuttle, like the Skylab, like the space telescopes that were all pushing to get larger portions of the budget. And so attention was turned in the Nixon administration and the following administrations to other things. And so after Apollo came kind of a dry spell, the lean years. In 74, these little figures, you aren't going to be able to read them, but the ones that are off the surface were orbiters and the others were on the surface in some way. The first 3 there on the left were Russian. And we wondered whether the Russians would now land some people up there. They probably had the capability to do it. They never did. And so they had the next 3 missions. 2 of them were landers and 1 of them was an orbiter. And then if you could read the scale at the bottom, you'd see that we had effectively the lean decades, because the next lunar mission was in 1990. And it was the Japanese for the first time orbiting the moon. Then we had a number of American programs after the Soviet Union broke up in the 90s. And the Russians have never done anything meaningful again with the moon since the end of the Soviet Union. Now we had a number of American programs, and in 2003 came the first European orbiter. And then in the last 16 years, it's been a pretty popular place. We've done some very significant things, the Americans, in that you see the one on the surface isn't just hitting, but it's splashing up some water there. That was the L-Cross, where we aimed a, if you will, an upper stage at the depths of a very cold and dark crater near the South Pole. And then we followed it with an experimental, or I should say, an instrumented spacecraft that could not just image what happened, but take spectral measurements of it and confirm that the darkened craters at both poles of the moon hold an enormous amount of water. They're always, the moon, like the Earth, is in the same vertical or the same orientation, not tipped towards the sun very much. And so the poles, if they're very deep, have never seen the sun. So they're very cold, some of the coldest places in the universe. As a matter of fact, the coldest place we've measured, including all the satellites, 10 times further away out at Saturn. This is still colder than any of them by our measurements. And so there's lots of trapped ice in these craters on the moon that we're going to take good use of at some point. Then China got into the act in the last 16 years. And so these three were their first two and then orbiting vehicles, and then one on the surface. They're all called Chang'e, CHANG''E, which I'm told is the Chinese word for moon goddess, like Artemis is in our language. At any rate, that was their first three Chang'es, very successful. And the latest one created quite a splash because for the first time, they landed one in a deep crater near the South Pole, but on the far side of the moon, the side that's never facing us. And so they're exploring over there. Here's a picture from their lander. You can see the lander parts in the foreground there, and you can see some tracks in the middle of the image, which is a small rover that they had on board that was driving away here. And now it's driven a number of kilometers on the surface, and that's called the U-22. It's kind of cute. It's little, but it's gotten a lot of good data. It's still going, and it's quite a bit smaller than the lunar rovers, but it's been successful for them. So the Chinese are very much coming fast at this point. They have a very successful space station that they finished building and putting their own astronauts, which they call taikonauts, into last year. And so we've got our own space race going with the Chinese now as we look to what comes next. And so our next program, which no doubt you've heard about, Artemis, named after the twin sister of Apollo, moon goddess. And the original intent when the push was put on and the name was given in the middle of the last administration was to put astronauts on the moon by 2024. And most of the people that had been actually involved in space programs and large developments thought this was a crazy thing, that it could never happen. And we thought it for good reason, and we were right. There was no possible way when they decided this that they were going to finish all the development that they needed to before and safely land in 2024. So we're not. That's been officially announced not. The latest date they've given is December of 2025, if everything goes well between now and then. And we all know how that typically goes these days. So the guess is that maybe by 2026, we'll get somebody on the moon a few years from now. The Chinese are working hard to get there, but they have a conservative statement of maybe by 2030, I think. So we'll probably have the next people on the moon within a few years. It'll be the Artemis program. And here's the vehicles that will do it. In November, finally came the successful launch of the full-up moon rocket. It's called the SLS, the Space Launch System. And the Space Launch System in November with this launch finally launched something that was more powerful than the Saturn V. So after those, the Saturn V was conceived in the 50s, built in the 60s. And so here we are 70 years later, we finally have a successful launch of a more powerful rocket. It is matched, its power is matched only by its budget. It's hugely successful or expensive program. And you're probably well aware of what Elon Musk has done, or somewhat aware of it. His Starship is going to be literally twice as powerful as this. And it was designed to go to Mars, but it's also been offered as perhaps the next thing to take us to the moon. It hasn't successfully flown yet, but the pieces of it have. And so we'll see how this goes. Boeing has been the prime on this for over a decade. And I have to say, it's been one delay after another. And they cost well over $1 billion each just for the launch vehicle. So I'm hoping something else will come along, actually. But for the time being, we have a successful and useful space launch system. And so that particular part of the system works. The space capsule is built by Lockheed Martin, my former employer up in King of Prussia. And that's an unmanned version of it, was on top of this latest launch with a dummy on board. And the Orion vehicle will be the one that carries the human beings up to lunar orbit, but not down to the surface. They're planning something called the Gateway. The Gateway is sort of a mini space station, which isn't actually very far along yet. It's going to be a number of years before the Gateway is done. And so to get there on the surface within a couple of years or so, they're going to have a quote, human landing system, which they've just recently contracted for. And an interim version of that is what they hope to use when they finally get there in the next few years. So there's some development left there. This is the status. The Orion's ready. It looks like the Space Launch System is. And so we'll see when they actually achieve this. There's supposed to be the first manned flight with the Orion next year. I think that's right, 2024. And again, the possible landing in December of 2025. That's about it, folks.
Wow.
So I'm
That was good.
happy to answer questions.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Is is the intention this time to have a manned space post on the moon continually, or are they going to keep going back and forth?
Eventually, when the Gateway, which used to be called the Lunar Gateway, but if you want to Google it, it's just called the Gateway now. When that's completed, which is a number of years off now, that will be a space station essentially to be used for astronauts to dock as they go to the lunar orbit and then undock and go down to the surface and come back to. So that's a number of years away. At that point, the picture is that there will be a number of missions with a number of crews fairly steadily going back and forth, some of whom will be taking materials down to the surface, and they're going to go to the South Pole. That's clear. They've targeted where they're going to go. That's where the water is in the craters. They want to prove out on the surface the capability to extract that water. I mean, water, H2O, these rockets have hydrogen as a fuel and oxygen as the oxidizer. So if you take water, you can create rocket fuel out of it. So it's not just so that they can survive with water, it's so that they can get fuel and launch from there. That's been known and planned for years. Now we know the sources of the water. When they prove that out, and when they have the carrying capability to get material down to the surface, they will, they say, put some kind of a permanent, continuously manned capability on the surface. And one of the things they're looking at, let me just I'll get to you just a second. One of the things they're looking at is something called lunar pits, which I talk about in another one of my talks. And these are basically places where the surface has just basically dropped maybe 100, 200, 300 feet down. And we think it's where there are lava tubes under the surface, which would become caves. And so they're looking at ways to find one of these lunar pits so that they can go in there and get out of the cosmic rays and the solar radiation, which are really deadly. I mean, to be out in that steady sunlight without any atmosphere, out in that rain of cosmic rays without much protection all the time, it's a problem already in the space station and for people that go into space for extended periods, like our space station astronauts do. There's no question that cosmic rays at some point lead to mutations of our cells. It's dangerous. And it's just a known risk. And on the lunar surface, if you're exposed all the time, it's going to be a problem. So the alternate to something like that is building a structure where you can be in the shadows a lot of the time, because there isn't a lot of shadow on the moon. So that's a long answer, but that's some of the things I know about their plans, but they don't have any very specific plans. of what that will look like and when. Let me go to the gentleman back.
Does the International Space Station have any role in this?
No, no. One of the, a fellow Air Force graduate who was an astronaut has been vocal about the fact that he was a space station astronaut. And when they were considering this gateway, he said, you know, why do we need another space station out there as a stepping stone? We already have one. Why don't we use this? Anyway, at any rate, in their wisdom, they've decided to have a lunar gateway space station. Yes.
One of the big problems for space travel is the fact that most of the mass used to launch a vehicle is engine and fuel. And without some new method, I don't see how we can possibly travel with people to anything other than our own solar system.
There's no question about that. You know, most people don't think the numbers, but we've got two little spacecraft that are out in what's called the Kuiper Belt, roughly 50 astronomical units, which is an astronomical unit's about 100 million miles. So they've gotten that far. And that's frankly kind of in the inner reaches of the space of the solar system still. And they were launched in 76 and 77. Okay. And they're going 40, 50,000 miles an hour. Chemical rockets and no kind of known rocket
Right.
can move us fast enough. I mean, these movies that you might think of as science fiction that show people sleeping and generations being born en route, those are real. Those are true. Not that we want to do that or have any plans, but that's real. And warp drive is wonderful. It's just not a thing. So you can't go faster than light. And at 50,000 miles an hour, getting to the nearest star, which is 4 light years, about 25 trillion miles away, takes a lifetime to get there. Okay, that's the nearest star.
Wow.
Yes, sir.
I have a quick comment and then a question. In February of 1962, you mentioned Glenn.
Mhm.
I was in the B-52. We were going into Patrick Air Force Base, and they vectored us away from there. And when we did, we saw John Glenn come up through the clouds,
Oh, yeah.
which was fantastic. I'll never forget that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the question is, China is going to the far side of the moon. Is that a good reason to look for aliens there?
No.
Is it?
No, they're going to the far side because the geology of the moon is well known everywhere. Our lunar reconnaissance orbiter, which I showed in a circle that I didn't talk about, has been orbiting the moon since 2009. We've mapped the moon over and over again, the topography of it, the high resolution views of all the craters. There's an area called SPA on the backside of the moon toward the South Pole. South Pole Aitken Basin is what it is. It's the largest known impact crater in the entire solar system, not just on the moon. I remember the moon has no atmosphere, so it gets hit dozens of times a day with meteors, asteroids, basically. But the point is that SPA, being a lowland, being towards the South Pole, is a target for us as well. It's a place that we want to go because it's probably going to be a good place for the early exploring to be done. That's why they're there. I'm not a good person to ask about aliens. I can't take any of that seriously, I'm afraid. Maybe a lack of imagination, which any good scientist actually does when it comes down to those things. It's like global warming. People wonder, are these scientists just telling us something, because they want to believe it or they did research? Scientists are the most skeptical group. especially if somebody has come up with a finding in an area that they've been working in because they're competitors. So they test out each other's ideas, and believe me, if it gets out there and it becomes the consensus as global warming has been for now decades, there's no question about that. It's something that's been tested and tested in my global warming talk, which I gave a few days ago. So these things are fresh in my mind. I like to point out that in 1917, over 100 years ago, a famous scientist named Alexander Graham Bell observed Henry Ford's assembly line and the first million Model Ts and said, gasoline powered, we got a problem here. He said, our atmosphere is going to be hit like a hothouse with greenhouse gases. And there's going to be a huge global warming. And we need to start to look at things like solar energy over 100 years ago.
Wow.
We are a slow species to act. Incredible. More questions? I really appreciate your letting me talk to you and tell my little stories.
John, it's a pleasure to have you in person. We enjoyed your 2 previous Zoom chats, but it's always very informative and somewhat entertaining even, at least for me, to hear clear explanations of what has happened and where we might be going in language that is understandable, at least imaginably understandable, put our own understanding to what you're telling us. But thank you very much.
And on behalf of NASA, I thank you because it's their story. And I now have to give credit to the ambassador program. I usually say this at the beginning. In my experience, there's no better taxpayer value. There are over 1,000 of us out giving talks that are providing you with insights that we get from NASA scientists and engineers regularly in teleconferences. And there's one paid individual on contract at JPL running the entire program. That's pretty good expenditure on a PR program. Yeah.
Great. Okay, folks, that's the presentation for today.
Thank you very
And,